Beneath the city's shadow, the air was thick with the scent of rust and damp concrete, a signature aroma of the New York subway system. The dim fluorescent lights flickered erratically, casting elongated shadows on the cracked tiled floor. 17-year-old Amina Carter pulled her hoodie tighter around her face, trying to focus on the rhythm of her heartbeat instead of the unsettling silence around her. She had been in this station countless times before, catching the late-night train home after study sessions at the library. But tonight felt different. The usual hum of distant trains, the occasional murmur of tired commuters, and the robotic announcements over the speakers were missing. The platform was empty. Unnaturally so. She adjusted her backpack strap, checking her phone again. No service. Amina sighed. Just her luck. She had promised her father she would be home by 10. It was now past 11, and the train was nowhere in sight. She thought about walking up the stairs, trying to find a payphone, but something in her gut told her to stay put. The city above was still alive, bustling with people, yet down here, it felt abandoned, forgotten. Then she heard it. Footsteps. They weren't hurried like someone running to catch a train. They weren't casual either. They were deliberate, slow, heavy, like the person behind them wasn't in a rush, but wanted her to know they were coming. Amina's body tensed. She turned her head slightly, just enough to glance over her shoulder. A figure emerged from the shadows at the far end of the platform. Tall, broad shoulders, a dark uniform. A police officer. For a fleeting moment, relief coursed through her. Maybe something was wrong with the train system, and he was here to help. Maybe he would tell her the station was closing. Maybe. Hey. His voice was cold. Amina turned fully now, her eyes locking onto his. He was a white man, mid-40s, with sharp, angular features. His pale blue eyes were devoid of warmth, and his lips barely curled into a smirk. A badge glinted under the artificial lighting, but her focus was drawn to something else, the gun resting on his hip. She swallowed. "What are you doing here?" he asked, stepping closer. Her mind raced. There was no one else around. No witnesses. No cameras, at least none that she could see. I'm just waiting for the train, sir," she answered, keeping her voice steady. Another step. The leather of his boots scuffed against the platform. "This ain't a place for you, kid," he muttered, scanning her face with something between disgust and amusement. "You people always think you own the city. But let me remind you." He tapped his fingers against the grip of his weapon. The message was clear. Danger. Amina's breath hitched. Every muscle in her body screamed at her to run, but her feet refused to move. Don't show fear. That's what her father had always told her. Fear gives them power. But she was afraid. And he knew it. His smirk widened, as if feeding off her silence. "Where are your papers?" She blinked. "What?" "Your ID." She hesitated, reaching into her jacket. Her school ID was there, tucked behind a few crumpled receipts. Before she could pull it out, he lunged forward and grabbed her wrist, squeezing it hard. Amina gasped, yanking back instinctively, but his grip was ironclad. "What's the problem?" "Got something to hide," he whispered, his face now inches from hers. She could smell the stale tobacco on his breath, the faint sting of cheap aftershave. "Let go of me," she demanded, her voice sharper now. His eyes darkened. "That's not how this works, sweetheart. You don't tell me what to do." He let go, shoving her back roughly. She stumbled, barely catching herself before she hit the ground. Amina's pulse pounded against her skull. This wasn't just harassment. This was something far worse. Predatory. The subway remained silent. It was just the two of them. No witnesses. He took another step forward, hand hovering near his holster. "Get on your knees." Amina's entire body locked up. "What?" "You heard me. Hands behind your head." Her stomach lurched. This was it. He was looking for an excuse. If she refused, He would claim she was resisting arrest. If she obeyed, she would be completely defenseless. Either way, she wasn't walking out of this station without a fight. Her mind raced through every self-defense class her father had forced her to take, every drill, every escape maneuver, but none of them seemed to apply here. This wasn't a fight. This was execution. Her fingers twitched. Her phone. Text. Call. Something. She slipped her hand into her pocket as casually as she could, her fingers brushing against the cool screen. She didn't have time to type. No service anyway. But if she could at least get the screen to light up. Don't even think about it. The officer snatched the phone from her grip before she could react. He glanced at the screen, his smirk deepening. Trying to call Daddy? He taunted. Or maybe one of your thug friends. Amina's vision blurred with rage, her fingers curling into fists. Give me my phone back. Or what? He tossed the phone to the ground, letting it shatter against the concrete. Her breath hitched. That was it. The last thread holding her back snapped. She moved. Fast. Her knee slammed into his stomach with every ounce of force she had. He stumbled back, grunting, but recovered too quickly. His face contorted with rage as he grabbed her again, yanking her back. Amina fought like hell. Kicking, thrashing, clawing. But he was stronger. Much stronger. A sudden click froze her movements. The safety of his gun. You want to act like an animal. I'll treat you like one. The cold metal of the barrel pressed against her forehead. Amina stopped breathing. This was it. Her father's face flashed in her mind. His warm voice, his strong arms whenever she'd had a bad day. And now he would be burying her. A single tear slipped down her cheek. The cop grinned. That's right. Cry. Beg me. A new sound cut through the silence. Heavy. Fast. Footsteps. The officer hesitated, glancing up. And then, before Amina could react, a blur of motion erupted from the shadows. A man. Tall. Dangerous. And very, very angry. Get your hands off my daughter. The officer barely had time to turn around before a fist collided with his face, sending him crashing to the ground. Amina gasped. Her father had arrived. And he was not alone. A father's wrath. The impact was thunderous. The officer's body hit the cold concrete with a sickening thud, his head snapping back as he sprawled across the subway platform. Amina barely had time to process what had just happened. Her father, David Carter, had materialized from the darkness like a shadow brought to life. But unlike shadows, he wasn't silent. David didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, grabbed the stunned officer by the collar, and yanked him up like he weighed nothing. His movements were precise, controlled, but fueled by something far deadlier than anger. Cold, calculated rage. You put your hands on my daughter. David's voice was deadly quiet, the kind of quiet that sent chills down a man's spine before he realized his time was up. The officer groaned, his fingers scrambling for his gun. Bad move. David slammed him against the subway wall with so much force that the tiles cracked. I don't think so, he growled, twisting the officer's wrist until the weapon clattered to the ground. Amina stood paralyzed. She had never seen her father like this before. She knew what he was, a former CIA agent, a man who had spent years in the field, handling situations most people couldn't even imagine. But she had never seen him fight. Never seen him move like this. It was terrifying. And yet, it was also the first time she had felt truly safe in the last 10 minutes. The officer, his face twisted with fury and pain, tried to break free. You think you can. David cut him off. His fist drove into the man's stomach like a sledgehammer. The officer choked, gasping as his knees buckled. Don't talk. David's grip tightened. His voice was like steel. You lost the right to speak when you pulled a gun on my little girl. Amina's breath hitched. She had never seen her father like this before, but she also had never been more grateful. The officer wheezed, his fingers digging into David's wrist, trying to pry himself free. His eyes, once brimming with arrogance and cruelty, were now flickering with something else. Fear. You don't understand, the officer choked. David leaned in, his expression unreadable. No, I understand perfectly. His fingers tightened around the officer's throat. You're just another coward who thinks a badge makes you untouchable. The officer gurgled, his face turning red. Amina suddenly realized something. If she didn't step in, her father might kill them. She had never seen this side of him before, but now she was witnessing it up close. The agent, the soldier, the man who had been trained to eliminate threats. And right now, this officer. He was a threat. Amina took a hesitant step forward. Dad. David didn't respond. His grip remained ironclad. The officer's eyes were bulging, his legs kicking weakly. Amina swallowed hard. Dad, please. David blinked. The moment shattered. His hand loosened, just slightly. The officer gasped for air, coughing violently as David finally let go. He collapsed against the wall, one hand clutching his throat, the other scrambling to push himself away. David took a step back, breathing deeply. His fists were still clenched, but the storm in his eyes was beginning to settle. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the officer's ragged breaths and the distant rumble of an approaching train. Then, David turned to Amina. Are you okay? The words broke her. A choked sob escaped her lips before she could stop it. She had been holding it all in, trying to be strong, trying to fight back. But now, standing in front of her father, the reality slammed into her like a freight train. She almost died. That man was going to kill her. She didn't imagine it. She saw it in his eyes. And if her father hadn't arrived in time. Amina rushed forward and buried herself in his chest. David caught her, his arms wrapping around her protectively. I got you, baby, he murmured, his voice softer now. You're safe. But Amina wasn't safe. Not really. Because that officer wasn't alone. Not in spirit. Not in power. And David knew it. A broken system. The officer groaned, still clutching his throat. You're going to regret this. David turned, slowly. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were like ice. You're going to regret what you did here tonight. The officer grinned, despite his injuries. You think you can just walk away from this? He coughed, blood staining his lips. You assaulted an officer. You know what happens to people like you. David's jaw tightened. People like me, he echoed. The officer smirked. Oh, I know who you are, Carter. CIA, right? Or, what was it? Former CIA. They don't have your back anymore. Amina stiffened. Her father didn't react, but she knew him well enough to see the rage simmering beneath the surface. You're done, Carter. The officer sneered, spitting blood onto the floor. You and your little brat. Amina's fingers dug into her father's jacket. David exhaled slowly, controlling himself. Then he crouched down, leveling his face with the officer's. You think your badge protects you. His voice was eerily calm. I don't need a badge. I don't need backup. I have something stronger than your entire precinct put together. The officer's smirk faltered. What? David leaned in closer. I have the truth. Amina watched as a flicker of doubt passed through the officer's face. Because David Carter wasn't just a man. He was a ghost. A former shadow operative who had been buried deep within the intelligence world for over a decade. And if there was one thing her father was good at, it was making monsters disappear. David stood up, dusting off his hands. You're done here, officer. I suggest you stay down. The man glared at him, but didn't argue. He knew. David turned back to Amina, taking her hand. Come on, baby. Let's go home. She nodded, still trembling, but clinging to his warmth like a lifeline. As they walked toward the exit, David's mind was already racing. Tonight wasn't over. tonight was just the beginning. Because this wasn't just about one bad cop. It was about all of them. And David Carter wasn't going to let it slide. Not this time. Not ever. The system strikes back. The city skyline flickered with neon lights as David Carter sat motionless in his car, gripping the steering wheel. The night air outside was thick with humidity, but inside, the tension in his chest made it hard to breathe. Amina was sitting beside him in the passenger seat, silent. Her fingers curled into the hem of her hoodie, eyes unfocused as she stared at the dashboard. The streetlights outside passed over her face in brief flashes, illuminating the dried tear tracks on her cheeks, the bruises forming on her wrists where the officer had grabbed her. David clenched his jaw. She hadn't spoken since they left the subway. She hadn't cried either. She was shutting down. It was the same look he had seen before, on soldiers after a firefight, on civilians after an ambush. The weight of trauma crushing them from the inside out. But this was his daughter. He reached out, gently placing a hand over hers. "Baby." His voice was soft, but she flinched. She turned toward him, blinking as if she just remembered he was there. Her lips parted slightly, like she wanted to say something, but no words came out. David's heart ached. "Amina, look at me." She did. "You're safe now." Her mouth twisted, something unreadable flickering in her eyes. Safe. That word meant nothing anymore. Not after tonight. Not after she had been seconds away from dying. She turned away again, resting her head against the cool glass of the window. David exhaled sharply, gripping the wheel harder. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. A corrupt machine. David pulled the car into the driveway of their townhouse in Brooklyn. A familiar sight of home should have been comforting, but instead, a cold dread coiled in his stomach. As he stepped out, he scanned the street. 2 unmarked cars, parked 3 houses down. Their windows were dark, but David knew better. They were watching. They were waiting. Amina didn't notice. She just trudged toward the front door, moving like she was in a daze. David followed close behind, making sure she got inside before turning back toward the street. For a long moment, he just stared. He knew exactly what this was. The system was already closing in. That officer, Bradley Moore, wasn't just some random beat cop. He was a protected asset, a cog in the greater machine. And David had just smashed a hammer right into the gears. They weren't going to let it slide. They never did. David smirked. Good. He walked inside, locking the door behind him. A message from the shadows. At 2:47 a.m., David's phone vibrated. Amina was asleep in her room upstairs, but David had been awake, seated at his desk, his laptop screen casting a dim glow across his face. He picked up the phone. Unknown number. He answered. Carter. A deep voice on the other end exhaled. Jesus Christ, man, what the hell did you do? David's lips twitched. He recognized that voice. Robert Bobby Langston, an old contact from his CIA days, handled a problem. Bulch asterisk. Bobby snapped. You know who that cop works for. You just put a target on your back. David's grip tightened around the phone. I don't give a damn. Bobby sighed. Listen to me. The precinct's already working on this. They're burying the bodycam footage, falsifying reports. They're painting you as a violent civilian who attacked a cop unprovoked. David wasn't surprised. And the higher-ups. They're making calls. Internal affairs won't touch this. Media won't either. They're playing it real quiet. David chuckled. That's a mistake. Bobby paused. Carter, don't do anything stupid. It's too late for that. David hung up. His eyes flicked to his laptop. It was time to expose them. Unleashing the truth. David's fingers flew across the keyboard. He wasn't just any civilian. He had contacts. He had leverage, and he was going to use every bit of it. First, he accessed the subway station's live surveillance database. His CIA clearance was long revoked, but skills like his never rusted. Within minutes, he had bypassed the local security protocols and retrieved the archived footage. There it was. The entire incident. The way Officer Moore had stalked Amina. The way he had threatened her. The way he had pulled his gun, ready to execute her. David saved the footage to multiple secure drives. Then he drafted an email. One copy to a trusted journalist. One copy to civil rights attorneys. One copy to activist groups. And then, finally, a copy to the police department itself, along with a simple message. You have 24 hours to do the right thing, or I will. Then he pressed send. The fallout begins. By morning, the news was already spreading. Social media exploded with the footage. Hashtags like #JusticeForAmina and #FireBradleyMoore were trending. People were angry. The police department scrambled for damage control. They issued a vague statement about a pending investigation, but it was too late. The public wanted blood. Retaliation. At 6:15 a.m., the retaliation came. David was making coffee when he heard it. A sharp knock at the door. Amina, still in her pajamas, peered out from the stairs. "Dad?" David didn't answer. He walked to the front door, peering through the peephole. Two officers. Not in uniform. Internal affairs. No, these men weren't here for an official visit. They were here to intimidate. David opened the door. The taller one, a stocky, bald man with a smirk, spoke first. "David Carter, we'd like to have a word." David took a slow sip of his coffee. "Then say it." The second man, a wiry figure with sharp eyes, leaned in slightly. "You're making a lot of noise, Carter. Maybe too much." David chuckled. "You boys here to arrest me, or just waste my time?" The bald one smirked. "Not yet." "Then get off my porch." Their smirks disappeared. David stepped forward, lowering his voice. "I know exactly who you work for. And I promise you this. If anything happens to my daughter, if you even think about touching my family again, I won't just expose you." He tilted his head slightly. "I'll bury you." Silence. Then the men stepped back. "Careful, Carter," the wiry one muttered. "People who dig too deep tend to disappear." David smiled. "Then you better pray I don't." He shut the door in their faces. Amina was staring at him. "Dad, what's happening?" David exhaled. "War, sweetheart." His eyes darkened. "And I don't plan on losing." A war on two fronts. The thin line between hunter and prey. The moment David Carter shut the door, he knew. This wasn't just a fight. This was war. The system had fired the first shot when they tried to bury what happened to Amina. When they sent their men to intimidate him at his own doorstep, they made a fatal mistake. They thought he was just a civilian. They thought he'd back down. They had no idea who they were dealing with. David Carter wasn't just a father. He wasn't just a former CIA operative. He was a man with nothing left to lose. And the most dangerous kind of soldier. The one who fights for his family. The pieces begin to move. The knock at the door was just the beginning. By noon, his bank accounts were frozen. By evening, his name was flagged in police databases. By midnight, surveillance cameras near his home had suddenly gone offline. They were setting him up. David had seen this playbook before. It was a standard CIA takedown strategy. First, isolate the target. Then, destroy their credibility. Finally, erase them. Amina didn't notice what was happening yet, but David felt it. The invisible walls closing in. The city streets outside weren't safe anymore. The familiar faces at the grocery store, the coffee shop, the gas station, they all felt like potential spies now. This wasn't paranoia. This was reality. And he had 24 hours to make his next move before they made theirs. A daughter's fear, a father's promise. Upstairs, Amina sat in her room, curled up on her bed, scrolling through her phone. Her social media was flooded with messages, some supportive, some hateful. The worst were the ones that said, "She's making it up." Typical race baiting. That cop was just doing his job. If she had just obeyed, she wouldn't have been in danger. Her hands trembled as she swiped past them. She felt sick. The world was watching her trauma unfold in real time, but instead of offering justice, half of them blamed her. A knock at the door made her jump. Her father stood there, leaning against the frame, arms crossed. His presence was solid, unshakable. "You okay?" Amina exhaled sharply. "No." David nodded, stepping inside. He sat on the edge of her bed, his expression unreadable. Amina clenched her fists. "I keep thinking about it. That moment, when he put the gun to my head." David stiffened. I can still hear his voice. Her voice cracked. I close my eyes, and I see his face. The way he looked at me like I was nothing. Like he was going to. Her words broke. David reached out, placing a hand over hers. "Listen to me, baby." His voice was steady. "You are not nothing. You are not weak. And you will never be alone in this." Amina swallowed hard. "What if they win?" she whispered. "What if the system buries this? What if nothing changes?" David met her gaze. "Then we burn the system to the ground." The next move. David didn't sleep that night. Instead, he worked. He hacked into the police department's internal network, not to plant evidence, but to uncover it. Within minutes, he found exactly what he was looking for. Officer Bradley Moore's personnel file. A history of violent complaints, dozens of them. Multiple accidental discharges of his weapon, always against young black men. All cases swept under the rug by his precinct. David smirked. This wasn't just about his daughter anymore. This was about all the lives this man had destroyed, and the corrupt network that protected him. With a few keystrokes, he sent the files to every major news outlet and every civil rights organization he could think of. Then, for good measure, he forwarded them directly to the mayor's office. Let's see them try to cover this up. They come for him. By sunrise, the backlash had already begun. Social media exploded with the new revelations about Officer Moore. News stations picked up the police cover-up. Protests started forming outside the precinct. David watched it all unfold from his laptop, sipping his coffee. Then, at exactly 7:12 a.m., his front door exploded inward. They sent SWAT. The first officer through the door barely had time to react before David moved. With a single fluid motion, he grabbed a coffee mug off the counter and smashed it into the man's face. The officer stumbled, blinded by shards of ceramic and hot coffee. David didn't stop. He twisted the man's wrist, disarming him, before using his own momentum to slam him into the wall. The next officer raised his weapon, but he was too slow. David ducked under the barrel, driving a fist into the man's gut, then delivering a vicious elbow to his jaw. 2 down. 3 more to go. Amina's terror. Upstairs, Amina bolted awake to the sound of gunfire. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Then, footsteps, heavy boots pounding against the staircase. They were coming for her. No, not again. Amina's hands shook, but she forced herself to move. She grabbed her phone, but before she could dial, the door burst open. A black-clad officer stormed in, rifle raised. Amina froze. His voice was distorted by a helmet microphone. "On your knees, hands behind your head. Now." She couldn't breathe. This was happening again. But before she could OD, her father appeared behind the officer. Fast, silent, deadly. David's arms snapped around the man's neck in a lightning-fast chokehold. The officer's body went rigid. Then, he dropped. Unconscious. David stood over the motionless body, his chest heaving. His eyes locked onto Amina's. "Are you okay?" She couldn't speak. She just ran to him, his arms wrapped around her, shielding her from the world. But as they stood there, the truth sank in. This wasn't over. The system wasn't going to let them go. Not after this. David Carter had declared war on the machine. And now, the machine was coming for all of them. When the system fights back, the dust from the busted front door swirled through the air like smoke from a battlefield. David Carter stood motionless, his arms wrapped tightly around Amina as the world outside continued to spin. Sirens screaming, orders being barked through radios, more boots pounding against pavement. The first wave of officers had been neutralized, but he knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. A silent battlefield. Amina's breath was ragged against his chest, her entire body trembling. She wasn't crying. She wasn't screaming. She was frozen. She had been here before. In that subway station. At gunpoint. Alone. And now, it was happening again. David tilted her chin up gently, forcing her to meet his eyes. Amina, look at me. She blinked, her pupils blown wide with shock. I need you to move, baby. We have to go. Her fingers dug into his jacket. Where? Anywhere but here. The escape plan. David had always known this day might come. A lifetime in intelligence taught him that you don't just make enemies overseas. You make them at home too. So he had contingencies. He moved quickly, grabbing a duffel bag from the closet. Inside were the essentials. Fake IDs, untraceable cash, burner phones, ammunition, a hidden Glock. Amina watched him, her breathing still unsteady. Dad, we can't just run. David zipped the bag. We're not running. He turned to her, his voice firm. We're buying time. For what? He slid the Glock into his waistband. To strike back. Amina swallowed hard. Her father had always been a fighter. But this was different. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about revenge. The streets aren't safe. They slipped out the back alley just as the second wave of officers stormed into the house. David didn't need to look back to know what was happening. They'd tear the place apart, plant evidence, rewrite the story. By morning, the news would paint him as a fugitive, a dangerous man who assaulted police officers, and Amina. They'd call her a brainwashed accomplice. The truth didn't matter anymore. Perception was the only weapon that counted. David had spent years crafting narratives in the intelligence world, manipulating stories, rewriting history. Now he was on the other side of it. Where are we going? Amina whispered as they slipped through dark alleys, her voice barely audible over the distant sirens. To see an old friend. The hacker in the shadows. They reached a rundown apartment complex on the east side of the city, the kind of place where nobody asked questions and nobody called the cops. David knocked twice, paused, then knocked once more. The door creaked open a second later, revealing a man in his mid-30s with messy hair, dark circles under his eyes, and a cigarette dangling from his lips. Jesus Christ, Carter. The man, Leon Devlin, stepped aside, rubbing his tired eyes. Do you ever show up with good news? Not really. David stepped inside, guiding Amina in behind him. Leon shut the door and bolted it. The apartment was a hacker's den, monitors glowing with green code, wires tangled across the floor, half-empty energy drink cans scattered across the desk. Amina eyed the room. Is this guy? One of the best digital ghosts in the country, David answered. And our only shot at flipping this thing before they bury us. Leon exhaled sharply, sitting down in his chair. I saw the news. They're painting you as some rogue lunatic, calling you unstable, unhinged, paranoid. David wasn't surprised. What about the footage? He asked. The files I leaked. Leon frowned. They're trying to suppress it, but it's already out there. He clicked a few keys, pulling up a news feed. Multiple headlines flashed across the screen. Former CIA agent on the run after attacking police. Dangerous black radical evades arrest. Armed and wanted. Officer Moore. The truth behind the allegations, sponsored by a police union. Amina's stomach twisted. David gritted his teeth. They're pushing the counter-narrative. Leon nodded. They're flooding the media with their version. They've got the police unions, the politicians, even some news anchors backing them. David leaned against the desk, exhaling slowly. How bad is it? Leon hesitated. Then he pulled up a live security feed from the NYPD. Amina's heart stopped. There on the screen was an official bulletin. David Carter, armed and extremely dangerous. Amina Carter, potential accomplice. And beneath it, a city-wide manhunt alert. Enemies in every shadow. Amina's stomach dropped. They put me on the list. She whispered, voice shaking. I didn't do anything. Leon shook his head. They don't care. They just need someone to justify the narrative. David's hands curled into fists. They weren't just coming for him. They were coming for his daughter. They were painting her as dangerous, as a threat, which meant that the next cop who saw her wouldn't hesitate. We have to shut this down. Now, David muttered. Leon leaned back in his chair. Easier said than done, Carter. The NYPD, the feds, and probably a few government ops are on this now. You're not just fighting cops anymore. David's jaw tightened. Then we take the fight to them. Leon chuckled dryly. Classic Carter. He took a drag from his cigarette. All right, I'll bite. What's the plan? David turned to Amina. You trust me, baby. She nodded. No hesitation. Then get ready, because we're about to flip the whole damned system on its head. The plan begins. David laid out his strategy. Hack the system. They needed to wipe their names from the police databases. Expose the corruption. Find internal leaks and whistleblowers willing to talk. Turn the public against them. Control the media narrative before they did. Go on offense. Bring down the corrupt cops, politicians, and operatives behind the cover-up. Leon let out a low whistle. Dan, you're really trying to burn it all down, huh? David's eyes were cold. They declared war first. Amina steeled herself. She was done being a victim. Her father had saved her life once. Now, she was ready to fight for it. Burning down the system. The war begins. David Carter leaned over Leon's cluttered desk, eyes locked on the glowing screens in front of him. His daughter, Amina, sat beside him, still shaken but more determined than ever. The weight of the last 24 hours pressed down on them like a vice. They weren't just running anymore. They were fighting back. Leon exhaled sharply, flicking his cigarette into an overflowing ashtray. All right, Carter. You want to burn the system. Let's light the match. David nodded. First, we erase ourselves from their database. Then we dismantle their whole operation. Leon cracked his knuckles. Easier said than done. Then let's start saying it. The hack. Leon's fingers flew across the keyboard. The NYPD's internal systems were fortified, but to someone like him, it was child's play. They marked both of you as threats. They'll have your faces flagged in every security cam across the city. He clicked a few keys, and a stream of encrypted code scrolled down the screen. So, let's change that. Amina leaned forward. What are you doing? Corrupting the system. Leon smirked. I'm making the databases show that David Carter died 3 years ago in a car accident. And you. He tapped a few more keys. Amina Carter was arrested 2 weeks ago in Florida for shoplifting. Amina blinked. What? They'll be looking for you here in New York, not in another state. David smirked. Smart. I know. Leon's fingers kept moving. Now, let's make their lives miserable. Flipping the narrative. Leon switched screens, opening a live backdoor into the city's police radio transmissions. They're already running damage control, Carter. They're feeding the media their version of the story. Violent ex-CIA agent assaults officers. Radicalized daughter helps him escape custody. David's jaw clenched. We need to get ahead of them. I got just the thing. Leon pulled up a folder full of buried police reports. See this. These are all the misconduct complaints against Officer Moore. Some of these were straight up deleted from the official records ***. David leaned in. How bad is it? Leon chuckled dryly. You ever see a house made of matchsticks? Yeah. Leon grinned. Well, we just found the gasoline. The first strike. David reached for his phone. There were only a few people left in the world he trusted, and one of them was a journalist named Isabel Reyes. He dialed her number. This better be good, Carter. I have editors breathing down my neck about your little incident. David smirked. I'm about to give you the biggest story of your career. A pause. Then, I'm listening. Check your inbox. Leon hit send. Less than a minute later, Isabel gasped. Oh my God. This is career-ending. Maybe even prison level. David's voice was calm. I want everything on record. I want the truth everywhere. You drop this in the next hour. Isabel hesitated. Carter, you know what happens when you go against cops. That's why I'm not asking. I'm telling. A beat of silence. Then, Isabel sighed. All right, but you better be ready for the fallout. David hung up. Amina exhaled sharply. Dad, are you sure about this? David turned to her. Baby, we're not just exposing one bad cop. We're exposing an entire system built to protect them. And the system was about to feel the heat. Retaliation hits hard. The first sign that their plan was working came an hour later. It started with a breaking news alert. EXTLUSIV. Whistleblower documents reveal NYPD cover-up of racial violence. Then it spread like wildfire. Officer Moore linked to multiple civil rights violations. Leaked reports expose corruption at the highest levels. Former CIA agent speaks out. They tried to kill my daughter. The public was enraged. Protests erupted in front of the NYPD headquarters. The mayor's office was forced to issue a statement. David watched the chaos unfold, his expression unreadable. Amina leaned forward, staring at the TV screen. Dad, we did it. David shook his head. Not yet. Because he knew exactly what was coming next. A counterattack from the system. At 8:43 p.m., David's burner phone buzzed. He answered without hesitation. Carter. A deep, gravelly voice responded. You just made a very big mistake. David smirked. I make a lot of those. You'll have to be more specific. A pause. Then, if you don't disappear, we'll make you disappear. David leaned against the wall, his grip tightening around the phone. You know who I am. Silence. You know what I'm capable of. A low chuckle. That's why this is your only warning. Walk away, or we come for the girl. David's blood turned to ice. Say that again. Your daughter. The voice was smug. She's a liability. Accidents happen all the time. Car crashes. House fires. David's fingers curled into a fist so tight his knuckles cracked. If you come near her, I will burn your entire world to the ground. Another chuckle. You can't fight the system, Carter. David's voice dropped to a deadly whisper. Watch me. He hung up. Amina looked up, concern in her eyes. Who was that? David turned to Leon. We're moving now. Leon raised an eyebrow. Where? David grabbed his gun and checked the magazine. To hunt. No more hiding. For the first time since this war started, David Carter wasn't on the defensive. He was going after them. He wasn't waiting for the system to make its next move. He was taking the fight straight to them. And by the time he was done, the world would know exactly who the real villains were, because if they thought they could threaten his daughter, they had just signed their own death warrants. The hunter becomes the hunted. No more warnings. No more mercy. David Carter had spent years hunting men like the ones who had just threatened his daughter. He had spent decades unraveling corrupt networks, dismantling criminal empires, and bringing down high-value targets. And now the system had just made the greatest mistake of all. They put his daughter in their crosshairs. There would be no more warnings, no more negotiations. Tonight, the war became personal. Building the strike team. David checked his watch. 9:07 p.m. The threats had come in less than 30 minutes ago. That meant the clock was ticking. He turned to Leon, who was already typing furiously, tracking the signal from the burner phone that had just called David. Amina sat on the couch, arms wrapped around herself, her phone vibrating every few seconds with notifications from the outside world. Protests had intensified. The police were losing control. The media was torn between damage control and sensationalism. Everything was spiraling. But none of that mattered. Right now, David had one focus: finding the men who were coming for his daughter and erasing them from existence. Leon let out a sharp exhale. Got him. David turned. Where? Leon pointed at the screen. The call came from a secured frequency. But I cracked it. He smirked. Your friends are hiding out at an abandoned warehouse near the docks. David nodded. Send me the coordinates. Amina sat up. Wait. What are you going to do? David's eyes were cold, unreadable. End this. Dad, you can't just. I can, and I will. He grabbed his jacket, zipping it up. They put a target on you, baby. I don't wait for threats to become real. I eliminate them first. Amina's hands shook, but David stepped closer, gripping her shoulders gently. I need you to trust me. Amina swallowed hard. Then, after a long pause, she nodded. Recruiting an old friend. David wasn't going in alone. He couldn't. He needed backup, and he knew exactly where to find it. 20 minutes later, he pulled into a rundown bar on the outskirts of town. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and cheap whiskey. And at the far end of the bar, sitting alone with a half-empty glass, was Deacon Dake Hayes, a former Marine sniper and one of David's oldest friends. David slid into the seat across from him. Deke didn't look up. If you're here, it means shit's about to get real. David smirked. It already is. Deke exhaled. Who's the target? David's eyes hardened. The NYPD. The politicians backing them. The men who just threatened my daughter. Deke finally looked up. His smirk faded. They came for Amina. David nodded. Deke downed the rest of his whiskey in one gulp. Then he set the glass down, cracking his knuckles. Tell me where we start. The warehouse ambush. By midnight, David and Deke were positioned outside the abandoned warehouse near the docks. Leon had hacked into the security cameras, giving them a full layout of the building. Inside, at least 8 men were gathered. Dirty cops, off-the-books mercenaries, and hired enforcers. All of them waiting. For David. David loaded his silenced pistol, checking the ammo. We do this quiet. Deke smirked. Quiet's never been my thing. David gave him a look. Tonight, it is. Deke sighed. Fine, but if shit goes south. David cut him off. We don't leave survivors. Deke grinned. Now that's more like it. With that, they moved. Silent death. The first guard never saw it coming. David's knife slipped under his throat, slicing cleanly. The man gurgled, collapsing into the shadows without a sound. Deke took out the second man with a silenced headshot, dragging the body out of sight. One by one, they dismantled the defenses, moving like ghosts. By the time they reached the main room, 6 men were dead. 2 left. The last 2 men were seated at a table, laughing, drinking. They didn't even realize they were the only ones left alive. David stepped out of the shadows. The men froze. One of them reached for his gun. David shot him in the knee. The man screamed, crashing to the ground. The last survivor held up his hands, trembling. Look, man, we were just following orders." David stepped closer. "Whose orders?" The man swallowed. "NYPD commissioner, mayor's office. They want you gone. You, your daughter. They said if you don't stop, they'll make an example out of her." David nodded. Then, without hesitation, he pulled the trigger. A single headshot. The man slumped to the floor. Deke let out a low whistle. Dan Carter. No hesitation. "Ha." David holstered his weapon. "I don't leave threats standing." Then he pulled out his phone and dialed. Leon answered instantly. That was fast. "Send the message." A minute later, a video was uploaded to every major news outlet, every social media platform. A video of David Carter standing in the middle of a warehouse full of dead men. His message was simple. "You came after my daughter. Now I'm coming after all of you. This war doesn't end until the system burns. The final war begins." The video spread like wildfire. David Carter had just declared open war on the NYPD, the mayor's office, and every corrupt official backing them. There was no going back now. Amina watched the video from Leon's safe house, her hands shaking. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was ready. David stepped into the room, blood still on his knuckles. Amina looked up at him. "What happens now?" David exhaled. "Now, we finish this. The system will fall. War on the horizon." David Carter didn't believe in fate. Fate was for people who thought the world was fair, for people who believed that good always triumphed over evil. But David had seen the world for what it was. Corrupt, broken, ruthless. And now, that world had forced his hand. Tonight wasn't about survival. It wasn't about revenge. It was about ending this war, on his terms. No more running. No more hiding. Tonight, the system would burn. The final target. Back at Leon's safe house, the air was thick with tension. David stood by the window, staring out at the dimly lit city skyline. Amina sat on the couch, scrolling through news feeds. Her name, her father's name, all over the internet. The NYPD was in full panic mode. They had no idea what was coming next. Leon cleared his throat. "All right, Carter. You've pissed off half the city. The cops are on lockdown, and the mayor's office is scrambling. So what's the next move?" David turned, his expression cold. "We cut the head off the snake." Leon's eyebrows rose. "Meaning?" "The NYPD commissioner, the mayor, every single high-ranking official who covered this up." Leon exhaled sharply. "Shit, you're really doing this." "Dan right." Deke leaned forward, loading a fresh magazine into his rifle. "All right, what's the play?" David picked up a USB drive from the table. "We go straight to the mayor's office. We drop everything. The corruption files, the body cam footage, the whistleblower reports. We force the media to air it live." Amina frowned. "Won't they just try to shut it down?" David smirked. "That's why we're going to give them no choice." Breaking into City Hall. At 11:45 p.m., David, Dake, and Leon pulled up 3 blocks away from City Hall. The building was on high alert. Security was doubled. The police presence was heavy. They knew David was coming, but they had no idea how. Leon tapped away on his laptop in the backseat. "Give me 60 seconds, and security cameras are down." David checked his watch. "Make it 30. Leon snorted. "You always were an asshole." But true to his word, 30 seconds later, the lights flickered inside City Hall. Cameras are down. Alarms are disabled. Doors are unlocked. David and Dick moved. They slipped through the side entrance, weapons drawn. Guards patrolled the halls, but David was faster. Silent, precise, deadly. One by one, they took down the security detail without a single bullet fired. By the time they reached the mayor's office, there was no resistance left. Forcing the truth, Mayor Robert Langston sat at his desk, sipping scotch, pretending he wasn't terrified. But David could see the fear in his eyes. "Carter, be reasonable." The mayor leaned back, forcing a smirk. "We can work something out." David placed the USB drive on the desk. No deals. No negotiations. The mayor eyed the drive. "What's this?" "The end of your career." David pulled out his phone, dialing a live streaming news station. The mayor's face drained of color. "Wait. You have two choices, Langston," David said. "You either read the statement I give you, on live television, or I release everything myself." The mayor hesitated. Deke cocked his rifle. "I'd listen to him, man. The world watches." 15 minutes later, the entire city watched as the mayor stepped onto live television. With trembling hands, he read the statement. "Tonight, I am revealing evidence of widespread corruption within the NYPD, including cover-ups, police brutality, and abuse of power. The people of this city deserve the truth." David watched, arms crossed, as the mayor continued. The police force, shaken. The media, stunned. The people, outrage. By the time the broadcast ended, David's phone exploded with messages. They had won. They had forced the truth into the light. But the war wasn't over yet. The final confrontation. Just as David stepped out of City Hall, a single gunshot split the air. A sniper. David hit the ground, rolling for cover. Deke cursed. "They're not giving up easy." From the shadows, NYPD's Special Task Force emerged, fully armored, heavily armed, ready to execute David Carter. But David was done playing defense. Gunfire erupted. David moved like a ghost, weaving through cover, dropping officers one by one. Deke took position on a rooftop, sniping targets with surgical precision. Leon hacked the police comms, causing confusion in their ranks. And Amina, watching from the safe house, hacked into a police scanner and broadcasted the entire shootout live. Now, the world wasn't just watching the truth. They were watching the cover-up fail in real time. The endgame. By the time the last officer fell, David was covered in sweat, breathing heavily. A single helicopter hovered above. A familiar voice came over the speakers. "David Carter, drop your weapon and surrender." David looked up. NYPD Commissioner James Holloway, the man who had tried to kill his daughter. David aimed his gun. But before he could fire, Amina's voice came through his earpiece. "Dad, stop." David hesitated. "You don't have to kill him. The world sees him now. They see all of them. We won." David exhaled sharply. Slowly, he lowered his weapon. The commissioner sneered. "Smart choice." But David only smirked. Not really. He tossed the USB drive into the air. Live on television, the final evidence was uploaded. The entire police department's crimes. The entire system's corruption. There was no stopping it now. The helicopter backed off. David turned away. "We're done here." A new dawn. 3 weeks later, the city was still reeling. The police chief had resigned. Multiple officers had been arrested. The mayor had been indicted. And David Carter. He disappeared. No one knew where he went. Some said he left the country. Others believed he was still out there, watching, waiting. But Amina knew the truth. Her father had done what he set out to do. The world wasn't perfect, but it was better. And sometimes, that was enough. For now.